A soldier's training tells him to ignore distractions. A man's instinct tells him to trust his dog for Navy SEAL Ryan Rodriguez. That conflict began when his dog Miller led him to a cabin hidden from the world inside. He found a woman who was running out of time and a little girl who was running from a monster. Ryan came to the forest to escape his past, but he just became their only future. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The Olympic Peninsula of Washington was a land of moody greens and shifting grays, a place where the sea and the forest were locked in a constant brooding conversation. Rain was the native language, a soft, persistent drizzle that fell from a sky the color of wet slate, turning the world into a watercolor painting left out in a storm. It was here, on a strip of rugged coastline battered by the Pacific, that Ryan Rodriguez had come to disappear. He had chosen this place not for its beauty, but for its indifference. The ancient Sitka spruce didn't care about the ghosts that walked beside him, and the relentless crash of the waves on the sea stacks was the only sound loud enough to quiet the ringing in his ears. His home was a small, functional cabin of dark timber perched just above the high tide line, a solitary outpost against the wilderness. Ryan Rodriguez was a man built of sharp angles and coiled tension even in repose. He was a Navy SEAL on extended leave, though the term leave felt like a lie. It was an exile. His face, framed by short dark hair, was a map of hard miles with lines around his eyes that weren't from smiling. His eyes, a deep guarded brown, held the flat, watchful calm of a predator, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from a profound familiarity with violence. He moved with an unsettling economy of motion, a quiet efficiency that made him seem like a shadow. Even in broad daylight, he was trying to forget how to be a weapon and remember how to be a man, and so far, he was failing his only companion. In this self-imposed isolation was Miller, a magnificent German shepherd. Miller was more than a dog. He was an anchor. His coat was a classic black and tan, his ears perpetually alert, his intelligent amber eyes missing nothing. Miller was a creature of immense discipline and unspoken understanding, a partner who had served alongside Ryan in places that were now just classified files and recurring nightmares. He didn't need words. A subtle shift in Ryan's posture, a tightening in his jaw, was all Miller needed to know. The dog was his early warning system, his therapist, and the only living being whose presence didn't feel like an intrusion. He was the keeper of Ryan's, 6 even here, thousands of miles from any war zone. Their days fell into a Spartan rhythm up before dawn, a brutal workout that left Ryan's muscles screaming a welcome pain that drowned out the unwelcome memories. Then, a long patrol along the beach, regardless of the weather. It was on one such afternoon, with the mist hanging heavy in the air and the tide pulling back to reveal a shoreline littered with kelp and driftwood, that the rhythm broke. They were walking north, the wet sand firm under Ryan's boots, the air thick with the smell of salt and pine. Miller was trotting a few feet ahead, his gait easy and confident, a dark shape against the gray canvas of the sea and sky. Ryan was lost in the hypnotic roar of the EA surf, a state of numb mindfulness he actively pursued. When Miller suddenly stopped dead, his entire body went rigid. His head snapped to the right ears, swiveling like radar dishes, focusing intently on the dense wall of forest that bordered the beach. A low growl, a deep, guttural vibration rumbled in his chest. It wasn't an aggressive sound. It was a warning, an alert. Ryan stopped instantly, his senses flaring to life, the fog in his mind vaporizing. He scanned the tree line, his eyes trained to see what others missed, searching for any sign of movement, any anomaly. He saw nothing but the dripping green gloom of the rainforest, the ferns, the moss-draped branches, the towering dark trunks. Nothing easy. Boy, Ryan murmured, his voice low and steady. What is it? Miller didn't relax. He took a hesitant step toward the forest, then another, his nose twitching, deciphering a story from the air that was invisible to Ryan. He whined a sound of profound unease and looked back at Ryan, his amber eyes wide and urgent. This was what set every nerve in Ryan's body on edge. Miller was trained for composure in the face of direct threats. He had stood steady in firefights, remained silent during stealth infiltrations. This behavior, this nervous, insistent agitation, was different. It wasn't about a threat. It was about something being wrong, deeply wrong. Ryan trusted Miller's instincts more than he trusted his own. Miller's senses were cleaner, unclouded by memory or trauma. "Show me," Ryan said, the single command, all that was needed. Miller didn't hesitate. He broke from his frozen stance and plunged into the undergrowth, not with a reckless charge, but with a determined purpose, pushing through the thick, wet ferns that marked the edge of the woods. Ryan followed without a second thought, his hand resting instinctively on the handle of the large survival knife sheathed at his belt. The transition from the open beach to the forest was jarring. The world became a tight, enclosed space. The roar of the ocean faded, replaced by an eerie, dripping silence. The air grew heavy, thick, with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. Miller moved with a certainty that belied the lack of any visible trail. He navigated the labyrinth of fallen logs and tangled roots, pushing deeper into the woods up a steady incline. Ryan moved behind him, his steps silent, his body flowing through the environment with the practiced grace of a man who had spent his life moving through hostile territory. He was no longer just a man. On a walk, he was an operator. His senses were fully engaged, cataloging the snap of every twig, the scent of the air, the subtle shifts in terrain. He felt the familiar cold adrenaline begin to seep into his veins. It was a feeling he hated, and a feeling he knew better than any other for what felt like an hour. They pushed. Onward, the forest grew thicker. Wilder, this was old country, a place where paths didn't exist. Ryan knew they had to be miles from his cabin in a direction he had never explored twice. Miller stopped, lifting his nose to the air as if tasting the wind before adjusting his course slightly and pressing on. He was tracking something, not a scent trail on the ground, but something carried on the damp, heavy air, a signal of distress. Ryan guessed that only an animal of Miller's caliber could perceive the silence of the forest was absolute, profound. There were no bird calls, no chatter of squirrels. It was as if the entire woods was holding its breath, just as a sliver of doubt began to creep into Ryan's mind. Just as he started to wonder if Miller was on a wild goose chase, the dog slowed his pace. He began to move more cautiously, his body low to the ground up ahead through the dense latticework of trees. Ryan saw it. A flicker of something that didn't belong. It wasn't the natural shape of a tree or a rock. It was a straight line, an artificial structure. As they drew closer, the shape resolved itself into the roofline of a small cabin, tucked so perfectly into a fold in the land and against a sheer rock face that it was almost perfectly camouflaged. It was old, weathered, but clearly maintained a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a fragile sign of life in the immense, indifferent wilderness. Miller stopped at the edge of the clearing, letting out a single soft bark. It wasn't a challenge. It was an announcement: we are here. Ryan stepped past him, his eyes fixed on the cabin door, his mind racing people who lived this deep in the woods, this far off. A nine-known map were either hiding from the world or hiding from someone, and a cold, hard knot in his gut told him that whatever was inside that cabin was the source of the deep and terrible wrongness that his dog had sensed from miles away. He had come to this place seeking peace, but the soldier in him knew with absolute certainty that he had just found a war. Ryan approached the cabin with the ingrained caution of a man who knew that doors could hide threats as well as shelter. He moved in a low crouch, using the thick trunk of a fallen cedar as cover. While Miller crept silently beside him, a dark shadow pressed to the forest floor. From this new vantage point, Ryan could see the details. The cabin was built with skill. Its logs expertly notched its roof, thatched with a mix of moss and cedar shakes that made it blend seamlessly into the hillside. It was a place built to remain unseen. There were no windows on the side facing him, a deliberate defensive choice. Whoever was inside knew how to think about security. His instincts screamed that this was not a simple hermit's dwelling. He listened. The wind sighed through the high branches of the pines, and a steady drip of water echoed from a nearby rock face. Underneath those sounds, he caught at a faint, dry cough, followed by a weak, muffled moan. It was a sound of genuine suffering. It changed the entire dynamic of the situation. This wasn't a potential ambush. It was a sick bay. Miller whined softly, a low note of confirmation. Ryan made a decision. He moved from behind the log, his steps deliberate and quiet on the damp earth, stopping a few feet from the cabin's single heavy plank door. He didn't knock. Years of training had taught him that announcing your presence on a stranger's doorstep was a courtesy you couldn't always afford before he could decide on his next move. A voice drifted through the wood, thin and ragged, barely a whisper. "Please, is someone there?" "Please." The voice was female, strained with a desperation that cut through Ryan's PR. "Oh, professional detachment?" He pushed the door. It swung inward on groaning leather hinges, revealing a room steeped in shadows and the scent of wood smoke and sickness. The interior was Spartan, lit only by the weak flickering flames in a small stone fireplace. In the gray light that filtered through a single grime-covered window at the far end of the room, it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. In the corner, lying on a simple cot made of stretched canvas and wood, was a woman. Her face was pale and slick with sweat in the firelight, her dark hair tangled on a thin pillow. This was Ilara Hayes. Even in her weakened state, there was an unmistakable strength in the set of her jaw and the fierce, intelligent light in her eyes as they locked onto him. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, but exhaustion and illness had carved years onto her features from the darkest corner of the room. Another figure emerged. A little girl, no older than 5, stepped silently into the dim light. This was Serafina, though Ryan would come to know her as Sarah. She was small for her age, dressed in practical but worn clothes that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her brown hair was a wild tangle, but it was her eyes that captured Ryan's attention. They were large and dark, and they held the eye. The unnerving, solemn gravity of an old soul. She didn't cry or hide. She simply stood there, a tiny, silent sentinel, her gaze fixed on Ryan with an intensity that was both heartbreaking and intimidating. She was not just a child, she was a survivor. The dog, Ilara whispered, her voice cracking. You followed the dog. It wasn't a question. Ryan gave a short, sharp nod, his own voice feeling like a rusted tool in his throat. It led me here. He took a step into the room. Miller staying at his heels, watchful but calm. Ryan's eyes swept the cabin, his mind automatically cataloging their situation. A few empty cans on a makeshift shelf, a bucket of water that was less than a quarter full, blankets that were clean but thin. These were people at the Abies, Olute end of their resources. His gaze fell back to Ilara, the rapid, shallow breathing, the sheen of sweat, the tremor in her hands. He knew the signs. His training as a SEAL included advanced field medicine. You have a fever, he stated, his tone flat and professional. How long Ilara struggled to push herself up, but a wave of dizziness sent her falling back against the pillow. Sarah immediately moved to her side, placing a small hand on her mother's arm in a gesture of profound practiced care. 3 days. Ilara breathed. It won't break. Ryan's eyes landed on a small, high-quality backpack tucked under the cot. It was a child's pack, made of modern, durable nylon with a small embroidered star on the front. It looked completely out of place in the rustic, hand-built cabin. A relic from another world beside it, half hidden by a blanket, was a sleek black rectangle, a satellite phone, its screen dark and lifeless. It was a piece of expensive technology. The small detail confirmed his suspicion. These were not people of the wilderness. They were refugees from a world of wealth and convenience, now stranded. I need to get you hydrated, Ryan said, his mind shifting from assessment to action. I have supplies at my cabin. It's a few hours from here. Ilara's eyes, bright with fever, filled with a new kind of fear. We can't leave, she whispered urgently. He'll find us. Ryan asked, keeping his voice level. Ilara's gaze darted to Sarah, a silent communication passing between them. The child's expression remained unchanged, a small, stoic mask he's looking for. Her. Ilara said, her energy fading fast. He has people everywhere. Her words were vague, but the terror behind them was real and palpable. She was not just sick, she was hunted. And the little girl at her side was the prize. Ryan felt the familiar pull of a world he had tried so hard to leave behind, a world of predators and prey, of missions and objectives. He had wanted peace, a quiet war against his own demons. But a new war had just found him. He looked at the child, Sar, who was now using a damp cloth to cool Ilara's forehead with a practiced efficiency that was utterly heartbreaking. He saw in her eyes a reflection of the same desperate hope he had once felt himself, the hope that anyone would care enough to stay and fight. His decision was made before he was even aware of making it. I'm not leaving you, he said. The words came out with a certainty that surprised him. I'll get my gear. I'll be back before nightfall. Ilara's eyes searched his face, looking for a hint of deception, a sign of weakness. What she saw was the unwavering resolve of a man who had made a promise and would die before breaking it. She gave a faint, exhausted nod, her body finally surrendering to the fever and an overwhelming sense of relief. Her eyes drifted shut. Ryan looked at Sarah. The little girl met his gaze, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than watchful fear appeared in her expression. It was a fragile, hesitant spark of trust. I'm Ryan, he said softly. This is Miller. The girl said nothing, but she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. Ryan turned to leave Miller at his side. He had a mission. Now get supplies, fortify this position, keep them alive. As he stepped back out into the gray, dripping wilderness, he knew his quiet life on the edge of the world was officially over. He now had a new objective to stand between this hidden refuge and the monsters trying to tear it down. The journey back through the forest was a different kind of exercise. Before, Ryan had been an explorer following Miller's instinct into the unknown. Now he was an operator on a timetable. The sun was beginning its slow descent, and the forest canopy was already stealing the light, plunging the undergrowth into a deep emerald twilight. Every step was measured, every glance calculated. His mind, which he had so painstakingly tried to keep empty, was now a whirring machine of tactical assessment. He wasn't just walking. He was memorizing the route-marking landmarks: a lightning-scarred hemlock, a distinctive moss-covered boulder, a stream that cut a sharp, deep line through the terrain. He noted potential ambush points and concealed observation posts. His solitude had been breached, and this patch of wilderness was no longer a refuge. It was an area of operations. Miller seemed to understand the shift in urgency. The dog moved with a new focused intensity, staying close to Ryan's side, his head on a constant silent swivel. He was no longer just a companion. He was a sentry. His senses extending Ryan's own, a living piece of his situational awareness. They moved with the fluid, synchronized grace of a team that had navigated far more dangerous places than this. The 2-hour trek felt like 20 minutes when his own cabin finally came into view. A dark, solid shape against the graying sky. Ryan felt a pang of something he couldn't name. It was the last outpost of his isolation, and he was about to plunder it for a war he never wanted. Inside the cabin was a testament to his life's discipline: a single bed with a neatly folded wool blanket, a small table with one chair. His gear was stored in military-grade footlockers. Everything clean, organized, and ready. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal trinkets, nothing to suggest a life beyond this Spartan existence. It was the temporary camp of a man who knew how to pack light and leave no trace. He went straight to the largest of the footlockers and unfastened the heavy steel latches. The top layer was what anyone would expect: spare clothing tools rope. But beneath that was the gear he had hoped never to unpack again. He pulled out a comprehensive trauma kit, its contents far exceeding a standard first aid setup. He laid out IV bags of saline sterile suture kits, pressure bandages, and most importantly, several vials of broad-spectrum antibiotics he kept for emergencies. He added a handful of high-calorie military-grade ration bars, a water filter, a small cooking pot, and a powerful LED flashlight with spare Bat-A. Rise. Then, he paused, his hand hovering over the bottom of the locker. He reached in and lifted out a heavy oilskin-wrapped bundle. Unrolling, it revealed a Sig Sauer P226 pistol, his former service weapon, and 3 full magazines. He checked the action with a smooth, practiced motion. It was clean-oiled and ready. He wasn't just bringing medicine and food. He was bringing a fight. At the very bottom of the chest was a small, locked metal box. He opened it with a key he wore on a chain around his neck. Inside, there was no weapon, only 2 items. One was a perfectly folded American flag, the kind given to the families of fallen soldiers. The other was a photograph. It showed 5 young men in combat gear, their faces grimy with sweat and dirt, but grinning at the camera. They were crowded together, arms slung over each other's shoulders. Ryan was in the center, looking younger, his eyes brighter. His finger traced the face of the man next to him, a man with a wide, easy smile and laughing eyes. This was Ben Echo Carter, his best friend, his swim buddy, the man who had died on their last mission, the mission that had sent Ryan running to this desolate corner of the world, a ghost with a laughing smile. He looked at the photo at the easy brotherhood captured in that single moment, and a familiar cold wave of grief and failure washed over him. He had made a promise to Ben's family, to himself, that he would watch his team's back, and he had failed. The thought was a physical weight, a pressure in his chest that never fully went away. He was choosing to get involved again, to make himself responsible for the safety of others. The logical, wounded part of his brain screamed at him that this was a mistake, that attachment was a vulnerability, that caring was a direct path to the kind of pain he had spent the last year trying to outrun. He had failed his brother. What made him think he could succeed in protecting these strangers? But then he saw Sarah's face in his mind, her small, serious expression, her old, watchful eyes that held no tears, only a grim understanding of the world. She wasn't asking for a hero. She was just a child, trying to protect her mother, holding on in a world that had clearly given her nothing but reasons to let go. He wasn't Ben, and Alara and Sarah weren't his team, but the mission felt the same. Stand in the gap, hold the line, protect the innocent. It was the core code that had been drilled into him, the very essence of what it meant to be a SEAL. Maybe he couldn't fix the past. Maybe he couldn't bring Ben back, but he could choose not to walk away from this. He could choose to honor his friend's memory by fighting a battle that needed to be fought. He snapped the box shut, the decision solidifying into cold resolve. He stuffed the supplies into a durable backpack, shrugged it on, and clipped the holstered pistol to his belt, covering it with his jacket. He was no longer just Ryan Rodriguez, the hermit. He was a protector armed and equipped for a mission. He gave the cabin one last look, a silent farewell to the quiet refuge it had been. Then he turned to his partner. "Let's go, Miller," he said, his voice hard. Time to go to work. The journey back was faster, fueled by adrenaline and purpose. Darkness had fully descended, and the forest was a mice maze of black trunks and deeper shadows. The air grew cold, carrying the damp chill of the coming night. Ryan used the powerful beam of his flashlight to cut through the gloom, but he relied more on his memory and Miller's senses. They were a single, efficient unit moving through a hostile world. When they finally reached the edge of the clearing, Ryan clicked off his light. The cabin was a faint, warm rectangle of orange in the oppressive dark, a single light against the wilderness. He saw it not as a stranger's home, but as his post, a position he had to hold. He felt the weight of his promise to return, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a purpose. Ryan pushed the door open and stepped back into the dimly lit cabin, bringing with him the cold, clean scent of the night forest. Miller entered at his heels and immediately went to lie by the hearth, a silent, reassuring presence. The small room was exactly as he had left it. Sarah was sitting on a small wooden stool near the cot, her back straight, a tiny guardian holding her post. She watched him, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering firelight, but she didn't flinch as he approached in the corner. Alara was stirring, her breathing still shallow and ragged. The fire had burned low, and a deep chill was beginning to seep through the log walls. Without a word, Ryan set his pack down and went to work. His movements were swift and economical, the practiced efficiency of a man operating on muscle memory. He added logs to the fire, coaxing the dying embers back into a steady, warming blaze. Then he turned his attention to Alara. Sarah watched his every move as he unpacked the medical kit, her gaze sharp and analytical. Ryan was aware of her scrutiny, but he didn't acknowledge it directly. He knew that for a child like her, actions were the only currency that mattered. He sterilized a needle and deftly found a vein in Alara's arm, taping down the IV line soon. A slow, steady drip of saline began to flow into her, a lifeline of hydration and electrolytes. He crushed a powerful antibiotic tablet, mixed it with a small amount of clean water from his own canteen, and gently helped Alora drink the bitter paste throughout the process. He spoke in a low, calm murmur. Not to her, but for her. This will help with the dehydration. The medicine will start fighting the infection. He wasn't asking for a response. He was providing information, creating an atmosphere of control and confidence in a situation that had neither. He worked with a detached focus, the same focus he would apply to cleaning a weapon or plotting a course. It was his armor, a wall of professionalism that kept the chaos at bay. Once Alara was stable and resting more comfortably, the steady drip of the IV acquis et metronome. In the room, Ryan turned his attention to the child. He pulled one of the ration bars from his pack and held it out to her. "You need to eat," he said, his voice softer than before. Sarah looked from the bar to his face, her expression unreadable for a long moment. She didn't move. Ryan didn't push. He just held it there, a simple, unconditional offering. Finally, her small hand reached out and took it. Her fingers were cold. She unwrapped it with slow, deliberate movements and took a small bite, her eyes never leaving his. An hour passed in near silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, Ilara's deepening breaths, and the distant sigh of the wind. Miller had shifted, moving from the hearth to lie on the floor near Sarah's stool, his great head resting on his paws, a furry, steadfast guardian. The antibiotics and the rehydration were working faster than Ryan had hoped. The violent shivering that had racked Alora's body had subsided, and the feverish flush on her cheeks was beginning to recede. She stirred, and her eyes opened. This time, they were clear. The frantic, fevered light was gone, replaced by a profound, weary lucidity. She looked at the IV in her arm, then at Ryan, who was sitting quietly in the cabin's single chair, cleaning his knife with a wet stone. "Thank you," she said, her voice still weak but steady. Ryan nodded, not stopping the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel. "You need to rest. I need to tell you what you've walked into," she countered, pushing herself up slightly on her elbows. "You have a right to know who's hunting us." Ryan stopped his work and gave her his full attention. "His name," she said, and the name fell like a stone into the quiet room, "is Julian Croft." She paused as if expecting the name to mean something to him, but Ryan's face remained a blank mask. He had been disconnected from the world of news and headlines for a long time. Ilara continued, her voice low and intense. "He's from Seattle, a tech billionaire. He founded Athenia Analytics. He's one of the most powerful men in the Pacific Northwest, and he is Sarah's grandfather." She described him not as a monster of overt physical violence, but as something far more chilling. Julian Croft was a man of quiet, meticulous control. He was in his late 60s, with a neatly trimmed silver beard and cold, calculating blue eyes. He was a philanthropist in public and a tyrant in private, a man who saw the world and everyone in it as a series of assets and liabilities. Sarah's parents died in a boating accident last year. Ilara explained they left everything to Sarah in a trust that she controls. When she turns 21, Croft was named her legal guardian. He doesn't love her. He loves her inheritance. He sees her as a key to a vault he can't otherwise open. Ryan listened, the pieces clicking into place, the expensive gear, the desperate flight. This wasn't a family dispute. It was a corporate takeover using a child as the prize. I was his executive assistant. Ilara said, a bitter edge to her voice. I saw what he was doing to her, the control, the isolation he was grooming her, trying to break her spirit so she would be compliant when I found proof that he was medicating her to keep her docile. I knew I had to get her out. This explained the child's silence, her unnatural stillness. It wasn't just shyness. It was a symptom of trauma. He won't stop. Alara whispered, her eyes finding Sarah in the dim light for him. This isn't about family. It's about a loose asset, a security breach. He'll find us. He has unlimited resources, private security investigators, men who get paid to make problems disappear. Ryan thought of the pistol. Now tucked against his back, it suddenly felt very small. There's one more thing, Alara said, her voice dropping even lower. I didn't leave empty-handed. She gestured toward the child's backpack before I left. I copied files from his private server, everything illegal, market manipulation, corporate espionage, blackmail on politicians. It's all on a multi-encrypted drive in that pack. I thought it would be my leverage, my life. Insurance. But now I think it just makes us a bigger liability, a loose end. He has to eliminate at any cost, the full weight of it, all settled upon Ryan. This wasn't just a rescue. He had stumbled into a war against a man who commanded a private army and had the power to erase people. His promise to a sick woman in a dark cabin had made him a direct enemy of a modern-day king. Alara, drained by the confession, sank back onto the pillow, her eyes closing as a deep, healing sleep finally took her. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah had finished her ration bar and had curled up on the floor, her small body nestled against Miller's warm flank. Finally allowing herself a moment of rest, Ryan sat in the silence. The rhythmic sound of the IV drip counting off the seconds he looked at the sleeping child. An innocent air caught in a vicious game, and he understood he hadn't just found a mission. He had found the one thing he hadn't had in years, a war worth fighting the deepest part of the night. The hour, just before dawn, was Ryan's watch. He sat in the single wooden chair, the reloaded pistol resting on the table beside him, a cold, heavy weight in the firelight. Alara was in a deep, healing sleep on the cot. Her fever finally broken, her breathing slow. And even beside the hearth, Sarah slept soundly for the first time in what was likely weeks, her small body curled against Miller's flank, one hand tangled in the dog's thick fur. The quiet in the cabin was a fragile thing, a thin pane of glass Ryan knew could shatter at any moment. He used the silence not to rest, but to plan. He had walked the perimeter of the small clearing in his mind a dozen times, mapping every tree, every rock, every shadow. He identified the two viable escape routes, the numerous blind spots, and the single most likely avenue of approach. His mind, honed by years of mission planning, was building a defense out of nothing but terrain and desperation. The first warning came, as he knew it would, from Miller. The E-Dog's head lifted from his paws, a motion so slight Ryan would have missed it if he weren't watching a low rumble too deep for human ears to register. As anything but a vibration started in the dog's chest, his ears, which had been relaxed in sleep, now stood erect, locked onto a single point in the darkness outside, far to the east. Ryan didn't hesitate. He picked up the compact, high-powered binoculars from his pack and moved to the single grimy window, peering through a small section he had wiped clean. He saw nothing but the pre-dawn gloom, a world of indistinct shapes and deep shadows. But Miller was insistent. The dog rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, a silent shadow detaching from the floor, and moved to the door, his body low and tense. Ryan trusted the dog. He kept the binoculars trained on the area. Miller was focused on a ridge about 400 yards away for 5 minutes. Nothing. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement, a shape that detached itself from a tree trunk. Then another, and another 3 figures moving through the forest with a fluid, disciplined confidence that made the hair on Ryan's neck stand up. They were spaced perfectly, moving from cover to cover, their silhouettes lean and sharp. Even at this distance, he could make out the shapes of rifles held in the low ready position and the dull gleam of night vision optics. They weren't trackers. They were hunters, a professional fire team. Croft hadn't sent thugs. He had sent operators. A cold, familiar calm settled over Ryan. The time for planning was over. It was time for execution. He crossed the room in 2 silent strides and gently shook Alara's shoulder. Her eyes snapped open instantly. Alert, the ingrained fear of the hunted overriding the exhaustion of her illness. "They're here," Ryan said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. 3 of them approaching from the east. "They're professionals." He saw the terror flash in her eyes, but she fought it down, her jaw tightening. "Sarah," she breathed. "Get her," Ryan commanded the far corner behind a wood pile. "It's the most solid part of the cabin. Stay down and stay quiet, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Alara nodded, her eyes wide, but resolved. She slid from the cot and scooped up her sleeping daughter, carrying her to the designated corner and hushing her gently as she began to wake. Ryan moved to the door, pressing his ear against the rough wood. Miller, a statue of tense muscle at his side. He could hear them now. The faint, almost imperceptible sounds of men moving into position. A soft crunch of leaves, the rustle of tactical gear. They were flanking the cabin, setting up a perimeter. A classic envelopment. They were taking their time, controlling the situation. Then silence, a heavy ringing silence that was more menacing than any sound. It stretched for a full minute. Ryan could feel his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in his chest. Finally, a voice cut through the pre-dawn stillness. It was calm, clear, and amplified, likely by a small bullhorn. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. "Alara Hayes, we know you were in there. My name is Wyatt. We have the cabin surrounded." The speaker. Wyatt was a man who wasted no words. He sounded like he was reading a corporate memo. His tone devoid of emotion. He was tall and lean, with short cropped blonde hair and a face that was all sharp, efficient angles. He was a man who saw this not as a kidnapping, but as a project, an asset retrieval. With a clear set of mission parameters, his 2 men were shadows in the trees, their rifles trained on the cabin's door and single window. "My employer, Mr. Julian Croft, has asked us to escort you and the child back to Seattle." Wyatt's voice continued, as reasonable as a business negotiation. "He is very concerned for your well-being. Open the door, and this can be handled peacefully. No one needs to be harmed in the corner." Alara clutched Sarah tightly. Her knuckles white, she looked at Ryan, her eyes pleading the drive. She molted silently. "Tell them about the drive." Ryan gave a barely pitiable shake of his head. He knew that revealing their only piece of leverage now would be a fatal mistake. It would show weakness and desperation to men like these. Desperation was just blood in the water. He remained silent, letting Wyatt's offer hang in the cold air. His silence was a strategic move, a way of disrupting their script. They expected pleading or panic. They didn't expect a disciplined, tactical silence. "Miss Hayes," Wyatt's voice came again, a note of impatience creeping in. "We are not here to negotiate. We have our orders. The child is to be returned. Your cooperation will make this process easier for everyone. Your lack of cooperation will be noted in my report." The veiled threat was clear. She was an obstacle, and obstacles could be removed. Ryan glanced back at Alara and Sarah. The little girl was awake now, her face buried in her mother's shoulder, her body trembling. He saw in that small, huddled form the ghost of every innocent he'd ever been tasked to protect. He thought of Ben. He thought of the promise he had made to himself, hold the line. He turned his focus back to the door, his knuckles white where he gripped his pistol. The men outside were a problem with a simple, brutal solution, but a firefight was a last resort, a bloody, chaotic gamble that put the very people he was protecting in the line of fire. He was outmanned and outgunned, but he was not out of the fight. "You have 60 seconds to open this door, Miss Hayes." Wyatt's voice announced, the false politeness, gone, replaced by a blade of cold command. "After that, we will be forced to make entry, and I can no longer guarantee the safety of anyone inside. The countdown starts now." The final word hung in the air. An executioner's sentence inside the cabin. The world shrank to the space of a single heartbeat. Ryan looked at the door, then at the two terrified people huddled in the corner. 60 seconds, 60 seconds, to choose between a surrender that meant a terrible certainty and a fight that offered only a slim, bloody chance at survival. The final seconds of the countdown stretched into an eternity. 60, a number that meant nothing. And everything. Ryan could feel the tension in the small cabin become a physical presence, a pressure on his chest. He saw the abject terror in Alara's eyes as she held her daughter, and in that moment he knew that waiting for the storm to break was not an option. A passive defense was a losing game in a fight. The one who controls the violence, who dictates the point and time of impact, holds the advantage. However slim, he would not wait for their breach. He would create his own 504. Wyatt's voice was a dispassionate metronome, counting down to the end of their lives. Ryan turned to Miller, who was poised like a coiled spring beside him. He gave a single sharp hand signal attack on my command. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. 3, 2 on the count of 1. Instead of waiting for the door to be kicked in. Ryan kicked it out. He burst through the threshold into the pre-dawn gloom, his pistol up and firing 2 shots fast, and controlled not at Wyatt, who was positioned off to the side, but at the operator closest to the door. The roar of the handgun was deafening in the enclosed forest clearing. It was an act of pure, calculated chaos, designed to shatter their plan and seize the initiative. The operator cried out, stumbling back, his rifle clattering on the rocky ground as bullets tore through his shoulder. The second operator, positioned near the window, was momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of the move. It was the opening Ryan needed. Miller now, he commanded. The dog shot out from the cabin like a black and tan missile, a low, savage snarl ripping from his throat. He ignored the wounded man and launched himself at the second operator, his powerful jaws locking onto the man's thigh. The operator screamed a mixture of pain and surprise, trying to bring his rifle to bear on the whirlwind of fur and teeth savaging his leg. Ryan used the precious seconds Miller had bought him. He dropped Ed to one knee behind the flimsy cover of the doorframe and engaged Wyatt, who had already recovered from the initial shock and was returning. Fire bullets splintered the wood around Ryan's head, kicking up dirt at his feet. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and pine. He could hear Sarah crying now, a thin, terrified sound from inside the cabin that lanced through the adrenaline and noise. He had to end this fast. He risked a glance and saw the second operator finally manage to kick Miller away, raising his rifle. Ryan shifted his aim and fired twice more. The man went down, but the fight was too uneven. The numbers were against him. The wounded man was already getting back to his feet, Pulling a sidearm, Wyatt was a professional using superior fire control to pin Ryan down his shots, methodical and precise. He was advancing using the trees as cover, expertly closing the distance Ryan knew he had seconds before his position was completely compromised. He had to move. He was about to fall back into the cabin when a small, dark object sailed through the air and landed with a soft thud in the center of the cabin's single room. "A flashbang, get down!" he roared, diving back inside and throwing himself over Alara and Sarah, shielding them with his body. The world exploded in a silent, blinding flash of white light, followed by a deafening bang that felt like a physical blow to his skull. His vision swam in a sea of dancing spots. A high-pitched whine screamed in his ears. He was completely disoriented through the ringing. He heard the crunch of boots. He tried to raise his pistol, his muscles screaming in protest, but a heavy boot stomped down on his wrist, sending a jolt of agony up his arm. The pistol was kicked from his numb fingers. A dark shape loomed over him. Wyatt, the man's face, was a cold, impassive mask. He placed the muzzle of his rifle against Ryan's temple. "The situation is now under control." Wyatt said, his voice as calm as if he were closing a business deal. The other two men, one Baal, eating from his shoulder, the other limping heavily, moved into the cabin and secured it. Miller, still dazed from the blast, was subdued with a sharp kick and held down within moments. Ryan was on his knees in the center of the room, his hands bound tightly behind his back with zip ties. The brief, violent explosion of resistance was over. Hope, which had flared so brightly for a few chaotic seconds, was extinguished, leaving behind only the cold ashes of defeat. Wyatt holstered his rifle and turned his attention to Alara, who was huddled with her daughter, her face a mask of utter despair that was an unnecessary and foolish display. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice holding no anger, only a mild professional disappointment. "My instructions were to bring you and the child back unharmed. My instructions regarding this man." He gestured to Ryan with a nod. "We're less specific. He has now injured two of my associates. That makes him a significant liability." He pulled out his sidearm, the click of the safety being disengaged echoing in the silent cabin. Ryan watched him, the ringing in his ears finally starting to subside. He saw the cold, detached look in Wyatt's eyes. This man would kill him without a second thought, not out of malice, but because it was the most efficient way to solve the problem he represented. He looked at Alara, saw her shaking her head in a silent plea. He looked at Sarah, her tear-streaked face buried in her mother's side. He had lost his training, his aggression, his skills. None of it had been enough against superior numbers and tactics. He had failed. The thought was a familiar, bitter poison. But as Wyatt raised the pistol, aiming it at the center of his chest, something shifted inside Ryan. The physical battle was over. He had no more moves to make in that arena, but another battlefield was opening up. One fought not with bullets, but with words, and will he could not win with force. But he was a SEAL. And when you run out of ammunition, you use your mind. He met Wyatt's cold gaze, and for the first time since the fight began, he felt a flicker of something other than desperation. He had lost the battle, but the war had just begun. The muzzle of Wyatt's pistol was a cold, dark circle, an unblinking eye promising a final, absolute end. The air in the cabin was thick with the metallic scent of spent gunpowder and the suffocating weight of inevitability. Ryan was on his knees, a captive, but his mind was clear, racing through angles and possibilities. He had one weapon left. He met Wyatt's impassive gaze, not with pleading, but with a look of cold, calculating pity. "Before you do that," Ryan said, his voice surprisingly calm and steady. You should probably consider the consequences of killing a U.S. Navy SEAL on a sanctioned leave. A flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed Wyatt's face. You're a long way from home, soldier. No one is coming for you. That's where you're wrong, Ryan said, selling the lie with every ounce of his training. When I saw you on the ridge, I activated a subcutaneous distress beacon. It's a standard piece of gear for Tier 1 operators. My vitals and location are being monitored in real time by a JSOC task force out of Fort Lewis. This cabin, this entire grid square, is a pre-registered emergency exfiltration point. He let the jargon settle in the quiet room. It was all a complete fabrication, but it was built on a foundation of truth that men like Wyatt would understand. Wyatt's expression didn't change, but a subtle tension entered his shoulders. He was a contractor, not a fool. He knew what JSOC was. A firefight with a lone man was a manageable risk. A battle with a helicopter full of Delta Force operators or Navy SEALs was a death sentence. You're bluffing, Wyatt said. But the conviction in his voice was a fraction weaker. Maybe Ryan conceded, a small, humorless smile touching his lips. But my last biometric check-in was over an hour ago. The protocol for a missed check-in is to deploy a quick reaction force. They don't call first, they just come. So the question, you have to ask yourself, Wyatt, is, do you feel lucky? Because in about 30 minutes, this entire valley is going to be swarming with men who make you and your wounded team look like amateur hikers. The seed of doubt was planted. Wyatt's eyes darted toward his men, who were now looking at him with undisguised unease. This was no longer a simple asset retrieval. It had escalated into something far more dangerous. Just as Wyatt was processing this new, unacceptable variable, Alara spoke, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the tension. His beacon is your immediate problem, she said, stepping forward slightly, placing herself between Wyatt and Sarah, but I'm your long-term one. Wyatt turned his cold gaze to her. You have nothing, don't I? Alara replied, her fear now completely replaced by a sheath of icy resolve, the encrypted drive in my daughter's backpack. You think it's just my leverage? It's not. It's a dead man's switch. She took a deliberate breath, her eyes locked on Wyatt's. I retained a digital security firm in Geneva. If I do not log in with a biomedically authenticated password every 24 hours, the entire contents of that drive are automatically released to a curated list of recipients, the FBI's Cybercrime Division, the SEC, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. Julian Croft won't just be investigated. He'll be front-page news on a global scale by sunrise tomorrow. This was the second more powerful blow Ryan had created, a tactical threat Alara had just unveiled, a strategic one killing them. Now wouldn't just fail to solve the problem, it would be the very trigger that detonated the bomb. You're both very good liars, Wyatt said, though the professional calm in his voice was now frayed at the edges. The data center fire at Croft's subsidiary in Oregon 3 months ago, Alara continued pressing her advantage, the one the fire marshal ruled as faulty wiring. It was arson. Croft was trying to destroy the server farm where the original data was stored. But he was too late. I had already copied everything. She had invented the detail on the spot. A plausible, specific event that added a thick layer of credibility to her story. It was a master stroke of deception. Wyatt was silent. The gears were turning in his head. Ryan could almost see the calculations. His mission was to retrieve the child and contain the situation, but the situation was now wildly out of control. Killing them guaranteed mission failure and the destruction of his employer. Capturing them was now fraught with the risk of imminent military intervention. His simple high-paying contract had turned into a tactical and strategic nightmare. He was a well-paid contractor, not a loyal ideologue. His primary objective above all else was his own survival and the completion of a contract, not martyrdom for a corrupt billionaire. He glanced at his wounded men, then back at Ryan and Alara. The power dynamic in the room had been completely inverted, though. Ryan was still on his knees with his hands bound. He and Alara were the ones in control. Wyatt lowered his pistol. He holstered the weapon with a decisive click. He looked at his two men change of plans. He said, his voice clipped in all business once more. Forget the beacon. Forget the drive. The primary objective has been updated. Secure the assets and bring them back for debriefing, both of them. He looked down at Ryan, then at Alara alive. Mr. Croft can sort this out himself. It was a victory, but a terrifying one. They had survived the immediate threat of execution, but now they faced a far more dreadful fate being delivered directly into the hands of the monster himself. Wyatt's man pulled Ryan to his feet while the other approached Alara and Sarah. The brief hope that their bluff might grant them freedom vanished. They had outsmarted the wolves, only to be led back to the dragon's den. Wyatt's men moved with grim efficiency, one pulling Ryan to his feet while the other began to secure Alara's arms. The air was thick with the bitter taste of defeat. They had won the psychological battle only to lose the war, destined to be delivered into the hands of the very man they had fought so hard to escape. But as the zip tie was about to be cinched around Alara's wrists, Ryan spoke, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. There's a third option. Wyatt, who was already turning to leave, paused. He looked back at Ryan, his expression a mixture of irritation and curiosity. I'm not interested in any more of your stories, soldier. This isn't a story, Ryan said, his eyes locking onto the mercenaries. It's a business proposal, one, where you and your men walk away from this clean with your full payment and with zero risk of tangling with JSOC or the FBI. He saw a flicker of interest in Wyatt's eyes. He was speaking the man's language now, risk and reward. You report back to Croft that the mission was a success. But with complications, Ryan laid out the plan, his voice calm and logical. You tell him there was a firefight. I was more than you expected in the chaos. A lantern was knocked over the cabin, went up in flames fast. You tried to get them out, but it was too late. All three of us, me, Alara, and Sarah, perished in the fire, unidentifiable. Wyatt stared at him, saying nothing, his mind clearly dissecting the proposal. One of his men grunted. He's insane. Croft will want proof of what Ryan countered. A pile of ashes he'll send a team to verify. They'll find a burned-out cabin and some charred remains you can leave behind from your supplies. Croft gets what he wants. Confirmation that the loose assets have been permanently dealt with the threat of Alara, and the data drive is gone forever. My JSOC beacon goes dark because officially I'm dead in a tragic accident. Everyone gets a clean slate. He paused, letting the logic sink in. Your other option, Ryan continued, pressing. His advantage is to take us back to Seattle. You walk us into Cross office and hand him all of this. The seal, the beacon, the dead man's switch. You become part of the problem. And men, like Julian Croft, are very good at eliminating problems. He won't protect you if the FBI comes knocking. He'll feed you to them to save himself. You know, he will. Every word was true, and every man in the room knew it. They were highly paid contractors, loyal only to the money. They had no personal stake in Julian Croft's twisted family drama. Ryan had just offered them an exit strategy, a way to complete their contract, while completely isolating themselves from all the dangerous complications. Alara, seeing the hesitation in Wyatt's face, played the final decisive card. To show you we're serious, she said, her voice steady. I'll give you something, a key to a single encrypted file on the drive. It contains proof of a minor insider trading deal. Croft orchestrated last year, it's enough to prove the drive is real, and that I have everything but not enough to trigger a major investigation on its own. It's your proof for a job well done. You can use it to guarantee he never questions your story. That was the final piece, the offer of proof. It was a brilliant move, transforming the bluff from a desperate gamble into a verifiable, mutually beneficial transaction. Wyatt was silent for a long moment, his cold eyes weighing the two futures before him. One was messy, unpredictable, and incredibly dangerous. The other was clean, simple, and profitable for a man like Wyatt. It was no choice at all. He finally gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Stage it," he said to his men. "Make it look convincing." The tension in the cabin didn't so much break as transform. The open hostility was replaced by a strange, surreal sense of cooperation. Wyatt's men, now following a new set of orders, worked with Ryan to make the scene believable. They used accelerant from their own supplies to set a controlled fire in one corner of the cabin, ensuring it would burn hot and fast. They left behind some spent shell casings and a damaged ration pack to suggest a struggle and its aftermath. Alara, using the now dead satellite phone's offline capability, IS transferred the single unlocked file to a data chip for Wyatt. 10 minutes later, the job was done. The cabin was burning thick black smoke billowing into the dawn sky. Wyatt stood at the edge of the clearing with Ryan and Alara as his men prepared to leave. "If we ever see you again," he began. "You won't," Ryan finished for him. Wyatt gave another nod, a look of something almost like professional respect in his eyes. Without another word, he and his team melted back into the forest, their forms disappearing into the gloom as quickly as they had appeared. They were gone. For a long, stunned moment, Ryan, Alara, and Sarah stood in the clearing, watching the flames consume the small cabin that had been their prison and their refuge. Miller nudged Ryan's hand, whining softly. Sarah, who had been silent through the entire ordeal, finally let out a shuddering sob and buried her face in her mother's leg. Alara knelt and held her tears of relief streaming down her own face. It was over. They were free. The days that followed were a blur of quiet healing. They made their way back to Ryan's cabin, a true sanctuary. Now Alara's strength returned, and with it the color came back to her cheeks and the light to her eyes. Sarah slowly began to emerge from her shell. It started with a single word, then a sentence. She started to play with Miller, her laughter a sound that felt like the first ray of sunshine after a long storm for Ryan. The change was the most profound. The walls he had built around himself for years had been torn down, not by force, but by the quiet, steady presence of this small, broken family. The silence in his cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft sounds of life. He found himself talking, smiling, feeling the sharp edges of his grief begin to soften on the fourth morning as they stood on the porch watching the sun rise over the Pacific. Alara asked the question that hung unspoken between them. What now? Ryan looked at her, then at Sarah, who was showing Miller a seashell she had found. He thought of his empty past and looked at the new, unexpected future standing right in front of him. Now he said, a genuine smile reaching his eyes, for the first time in years, "We start over together." He had come to the edge of the world to lose himself, but instead, in the heart of the wilderness, beside a woman of unbreakable courage and a child with the eyes of a survivor. He had finally found his way back. The war was over, and a new dawn was just beginning in our own lives. It is easy to choose isolation when we feel hurt or lost. We build routines and walls to keep the world out, believing it is the safest way to live. But as this story shows, the most profound healing and the deepest sense of purpose come from connection. It comes from the courage to step out of our own shadows, to offer a hand to someone else who is lost in the dark. If this story of courage, healing, and second chances moved you, please share it with others who might need to hear this message. We would love to hear your thoughts. So leave a comment below and tell us what part of the story resonated with you the most. And to ensure you never miss another story from our collection, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for being a part of our community.